You may have heard of space funk, but are you familiar with space dub? Or what happened when reggae blasted off into outer space? Coming up next. Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for joining me in the record room today. With the subject of space exploration being a big topic in the news very recently, I thought it would be fun to pull some space-themed reggae albums from the collection. That may seem a bit of an anomaly to some. Reggae, with its preoccupation with the sometimes harsh realities of life on planet Earth, nonetheless had a certain fascination with the subject of outer space, either the very real version unfolding in the news, in current events, as a topic on people's conversations, or the more fanciful representations in film and TV, movie-going, a popular pastime in Jamaica. So it was perhaps inevitable that the subject of space would eventually filter its way into the music coming from Jamaica. Perhaps the earliest, somewhat space-involved reference would come with the original supergroup of the ska era of the early 1960s, the Skatalites, seen here on Ska Authentic from the Studio One label. The group was originally to be named the Satellites, as the story goes, until saxophonist Tommy McCook made the remark that, no, we play ska, therefore we should be the Skatalites. Launching a plethora of ska puns over the decades to come, and trombonist John Drummond, another linchpin of the group, also acquiring the nickname Don Cosmic from Studio One founder Coxsone Dodd, seen here on the Don Cosmic compilation of ska instrumentals, latter-day compilation from Studio One, 2016 there. Moving ahead into the late 1960s, the DJs began to emerge. The toasters who would recite their lyrics over a pre-recorded backing track, often working in fanciful jive expressions or involving subjects that the average person in the street had on their mind, would be talking about on the corners. And this would inevitably start to draw in the occasional reference to space, with the DJ Godfather himself, U-Roy, leading off his debut album Version Galore from Treasure Isle, arch rival to Studio One. Version Galore album, first track, Your Ace from Outer Space. Not to be outdone, I-Roy would also contribute Space Flight, produced by Lee Perry. Curiously, Lee Perry not dabbling too heavily into the space theme of reggae, despite his enthusiasm for other aspects of film and pop culture, westerns, martial arts films, all making its way into his music. Never really got too much into the space theme that I can recall, though perhaps it can be argued that much of his music has sort of an extraterrestrial production aspect. Also in the late 1960s, a man who was never too far behind the current popular trends, Byron Lee and his Dragonaires, 1969, the moon landing, came out with the album Reggae Blast Off on his own Dynamic label. Dynamic, production by Byron Lee, and that would include a song called Space Fever. There would also be a further album from Byron Lee called Reggae Splashdown. I've seen that one, but don't have it in the collection. From here, the action would start to shift over to the UK, moving into the late 1960s, so-called skinhead era, where reggae made a foothold, a landing, if you will, in the UK pop charts, began to cross over to a young white audience called the Skinheads. While Derek Morgan was doing the Moon Stomp, a group called the Pyramids would change their name to Simmerip to come up with Skinhead Moon Stomp. Again, 1969, subject of the moon on everyone's mind. The band itself relegated to the back cover with the album's intended audience represented on the front. By 1972, Trojan Records were attempt to cash in on the fascination with outer space, which was increasingly being represented in television and on film. They would take some backing tracks from producers like Bunny Lee and Lee Perry in Jamaica and apply some synthesizer overdubs. This would be overseen by Trojan Records staffers Des Bryan, Webster Schroeder, and the synthesizer lines would be added by prog rocker Ken Elliott. The result was an album called Star Trek, obvious space reference there, credited to a fictitious group called the Vulcans. No such group, just instrumental tracks recorded in Jamaica with ARP synthesizer lines overdubbed in London. The Vulcans, Star Trek, kind of kitschy, campy, fun, set phasers for a good time on the turntable, but not really meant to be taken seriously. Track titles, the title track, I think, based on Johnny Clark's Enter Into His Gates with Praise. Tracks from Slim Smith also present. Titles like Dr. Spock, Vulcanized, Journey into Space, and also touching on a bit of horror with Dark Shadows and Dracula. This is the first ever vinyl reissue from Real Gone Music from 2019 of the Vulcans' Star Trek, somewhat of a cult classic sci-fi themed reggae album. However, it would be the arrival of a certain blockbuster film franchise in 1977 that would truly launch reggae's fascination with outer space into a much higher trajectory. By that point, dub had arrived in LP format and was reaching an apex of popular acceptance and commercial success, and it would be through the medium of dub that reggae would most fully express its fascination with all things space and science fiction. Perhaps the earliest entry into this canon would be 1978's famous Star Wars dub from producer Phil Pratt with the iconic Darth Vader cover. Looks like little TIE fighters and stormtroopers on there. First issued in 1978 on Burning Sounds in the UK. It's been reissued a number of times. I will have a more in-depth look at producer Phil Pratt coming up in the future. This takes tracks recorded by bands like Skin, Flesh and Bones and the Soul Syndicate at various studios, including Channel One and apparently Lee Perry's Black Ark. Fairly straightforward dub mixes. Includes at least one track by the Black Stones from their Insight album. Video games were also becoming all the rage in the early 1980s, as well as sci-fi, as that space trilogy of films began to or continued to unfold. And in the early 1980s, two new protagonists of dub would emerge as heroes and possible contenders to the throne of dub, as established by King Tubby in the 1970s. These would include King Tubby's apprentices, Prince Jammy and Scientist, mostly on a series of albums with no direct correlation to the subject matter of space or science fiction, but given colorful track titles and album covers in the UK. These would include albums such as Scientist Meets the Space Invaders, after the popular video game of the time. That one missing in my collection, I think. Not content, however, just to meet the invaders, Prince Jammy would destroy them on the album of the same name, 1982, issued on Greensleeves Records in the UK, with fanciful track titles like Martian Encounter, Conspiracy on Neptune, War in the Asteroid Belt, and what have you. Tony McDermott cover art. The two rival dub mixers, Scientist and Prince Jammy, would team up on Scientist and Jammy Strike Back. Gorgeous cover art there, touching on Star Wars, Flash Gordon as well. It looks like Roots Braddock Band, the real star of these dub albums, with their crushingly heavy, dense rhythm tracks, providing a suitable framework to show off the different mixing styles of Scientist, with his emphasis on Flabba Holt's bass lines, liberal doses of disembodied, ghostly vocal samples, and an elevated, stretched out use of a test tone sound effect as a percussive element, and Jammy's more hyper-focused, laser intense dub workouts, more minimalist, more controlled and restrained, two very different masters of the dub medium here meeting. Scientist has claimed most of it was done by him. Music on vinyl reissue of the 1982 album Scientist and Jammy Strike Back. There would also be the Dub Landing series of albums from Scientist, Prince Jammy also cropping up on Volume 2. These appeared, I think, 1981, 1982, Oralux reissue here from several years back. Dub Landing, again, taking the productions of Linval Thompson, the producer, with the band The Roots Radix, with their denser than lead rhythms, providing the perfect backdrop for very extraterrestrial leaning dub. But the highly experimental duo of Sly and Robbie, the Rhythm Twins, not being left behind, already incorporating a lot of electronic elements, synthesizers, syndrums in their music, much of it having an implicit futuristic feel to it, not really getting into the cover concepts too much, but the dub factor could perhaps be an entry into science fiction themed dub, with tracks like Ion Storm and Android Rebellion, taking the source material of tracks by Black Uhuru and running them through the dub workout mixing desk. Blackbeard, aka Dennis Bovell, would appear with Iowa Dub in 1980, apparently setting his course for planet Earth, the continent of Africa, on his dub album. reissue from a few years back, Iowa Dub by Blackbeard. Mikey Dread would also be seen at the controls of his Starship, Earth in the Viewfinder on Dread at the Controls, issued on Trojan Records. The DJs also were not going to be left behind, with Lone Ranger blasting off to the stars on Badder Than Them from Studio One, with Coxsone Dodd himself running things from ground control. Reissue from a few years back of Lone Ranger's Badder Than Them. Couple of later entries in the field, Don Carlos getting into the fray with Pass Me the Laser Beam around 1983, album for producer Bunny Lee, whose tracks had surfaced on that Vulcan's Star Trek album about a decade before. Another reissue from a couple of years back, Record Store Day One, I believe, Don Carlos, Pass Me the Laser Beam. And quite a late-breaking entry here with the African reggae superstar Alpha Blondy taking to the stratosphere for Coco de Rock, launching into space with tracks like Interplanetary Revolution. Most of these albums, however, used the sci-fi theme simply as a clever marketing concept on the covers and the track titles. There was little real relevance to the subject of space in the music, although with dub, the more expansive parameters, perhaps allowing the listener to fill in the gaps, use their imagination to take off on an imaginary journey into the stars. However, there were a couple of entries into the canon of albums during that time frame that I do think of as space dub, where the theme of outer space travel, of adventure and excitement beyond the stars was incorporated as an integral part of the music. One of these was an album originally issued in the UK in 1980 on the small Venture Records label. Very obscure at the time, though it's since been reissued and become a little bit better known. Quite sought after, even reissues getting hard to obtain. Captain Ganja and the Space Patrol by London-based reggae band Tradition. Tradition had been formed about 1976 as originally as Special Brew and revolved around Paul Thompson on keys. They were briefly signed to RCA Records, which issued the album Alternative Routes. However, the band, which typically plied some roots-oriented material with a smoother, more polished Lover's approach, also had an experimental side that would sometimes surface on their dub versions, and Captain Ganja and the Space Patrol was the fullest expression of their more experimental nature, beginning and ending with two different mixes of Reach My Goal from the Alternative Routes album. This was first reissued in 2017 by the Bouquet Versions label. This is a later quite recent reissue from Octave Labs out of Japan, translucent green vinyl with Obi. Was able to acquire this direct from Japan not too long ago. This features synth overdubs by Paul Thompson, some strange sound effects like a wailing baby and what sounds like tribal African chants, begins quite dreamlike and propulsive, as if you're floating off into space, before moving on into later tracks, becoming quite intense, as if you're embroiled in some sort of galactic conflict. Very obscure at the time, since become something of a cult classic and one of the key entries into what I think of as true space dub. But perhaps the ultimate album of space dub had a more convoluted genesis and no direct correlation to any existing vocal tracks, unusual for dub, created something as a self-contained piece. It originated around 1978 when the UK-based reggae band Creation Rebel laid down some tracks in the studio for budding white reggae impresario turned producer Adrian Sherwood. These tracks had been intended for an obscure London-based DJ by the name of DJ Superstar to toast or chat over. However, those tracks were not completed for reasons lost to the mists of time, and had not been finished to Adrian's satisfaction. Shortly thereafter, he would be introduced to an up-and-coming drummer from Jamaica by the name of Lincoln Style Scott, through their mutual acquaintance, Prince Farai. Style Scott would make his first trip to the UK from Jamaica, would enter into the studio with Adrian Sherwood and overdub some military-style drum lines over those uncompleted Creation Rebel tracks for Sherwood. But the tracks would then lay stagnant for about a year until Adrian and his friend Chris Garland dusted them off, brought them back to the studio. Adrian was in a financial crunch, needed to put some product out on the street to generate some income to keep producing. He was also deeply immersed in science fiction, and within his circle of friends, there was some talk about coming up with a reggae-themed sci-fi film for which these tracks would form the soundtrack to. The film never getting beyond rudimentary planning stages, but the album finally surfacing around 1980 as Starship Africa, memorably described by writer and DJ Steve Barker as what you might hear pumping over the sound system of the Starship Marcus Garvey with a crew of dreadlocked Rastas at the helm. This was reportedly mixed by Adrian and Chris Garland, who, according to Garland, both of them dropped a tab of acid before repairing to the studio to mix the tracks. Adrian wasn't quite satisfied with the synchronization of the instruments, paid careful attention to lining up all the beats and the timing, and would add splashes of echo and reverb almost at random, flip the tapes over in the machine and start all over again. The album would take the form of two sidelong seamless movements Starship Africa on side 1, subtitled Soundtrack from the Forthcoming Motion Picture, and side 2's Space Movement. Dub at its most experimental and sci-fi themed. Following this heyday of reggae's fascination with science fiction from about 1978 to 1982, the space theme begins to fade a bit, as it did in popular culture, losing a bit of popularity. Dub also beginning to recede somewhat, no longer quite as much of interest as it had been a few years prior. However, the space theme has continued to crop up from time to time. In 1995, the Jamaican reggae band Mystic Revealers putting out the Space and Time album, followed by Space and Dub. Leader Billy Mystic commented on one of my videos not too long ago. In 2000, Scientist took one of Culture's recent albums and gave it a full-length dub workout as Scientist dubs Culture into a parallel universe, complete with amazing comic book style cover art. This was reissued not too long ago on vinyl. Haven't got around to grabbing that. My original CD copy from the year 2000. And in 2022, Soul Jazz Records in the UK would put out a collection of Studio One dubs under the name Space Age Dub Special. Cox and Dodd once again venturing into outer space for a series of hard-hitting dub mixes from his Studio One label. And even more recently, Boston reggae band The Flying Vipers would release an album called Off-World with their signature blend of dub stylings and lead vocals, and follow it up with a full-length dub workout called World Inversion. Again, I would categorize this one as true space dub with a weightless or at times propulsive feeling and some vocals here and there. A translucent pink vinyl version of the Flying Vipers' recent album Off-World, dubbed up as World Inversion. That's my look at space dub, reggae gone into outer space. Let me know if I missed any big ones. Hope you enjoyed, guys. Quick personal update. Those who've been following along the saga of my dad, who'd been in and out of hospital in the early part of the year. He's doing quite well right now. Last week, we moved him into a retirement community. He seems to be thriving there, and we've put his old house up for sale. A lot going on, lots to do, but he's come a long way in a short time. So until the next video, thanks for tuning in, guys. Cheers and take care.